I think this is potentially the beginning of a number of influences and disruptions to business industry.
Until the events of last weekend, when British steel was wrested from its Chinese owners, who were accused of running it into the ground.
对于目前英钢经营遇到的困难，双方应本着互利的原则商谈解决。
Over the last few years, tensions surrounding Russia's war against Ukraine have unexpectedly intersected with the crisis at British Steel's Scunthorpe plant and China's far-reaching power in the global steel market. Taken together, these developments illustrate a growing recognition in Western capitals that industrial infrastructure isn't just an economic concern. It's a strategic foundation with profound implications for national security and sovereignty. The recent decision to effectively nationalise British steel at Scunthorpe, the new revelations about how Chinese involvement played out behind the scenes, and the unfolding war in Ukraine have turned an otherwise local factory dispute into a stark example of how larger geopolitical and economic forces can converge. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has underscored the importance of steel. Tanks, ships, artillery, and more mundane but vital infrastructures like bridges and rail lines all depend on high-quality steel. If a country can't produce its own steel, it's forced to import from foreign suppliers that might not be politically aligned. In Britain, this alarm bells scenario emerged when the last blast furnaces at Scunthorpe appeared to be under threat of shutdown, raising the spectre that the UK would lose its ability to produce virgin steel entirely, something that would weaken the nation's capacity for defence and self-sufficiency. While the war in Ukraine rages on, China's position in global steel markets has taken centre stage. In just 2 decades, Beijing transformed itself from a relatively modest steel producer into a colossal powerhouse that claims more than half of worldwide steel output. That shift involved a variety of methods, building enormous state-supported mills at home, buying or constructing facilities abroad, and flooding global markets with cheap, subsidized steel. The result has often been bankruptcies and closures for steel plants in higher-cost Western countries. The story at Scunthorpe, in the county of Lincolnshire, brings these threads together. The British government, under emergency legislation, took effective control of the site from China's Jingyi. Only a few years after that, Chinese firm had purchased British steel, making promises of stability and investment. Instead, the plant came perilously close to shutting down, with shipments of crucial raw materials reportedly cancelled or delayed. That forced a showdown at the gates when Chinese executives attempted to enter. Workers, fearing sabotage or closure, barred them from certain parts of the facility and eventually turned them away entirely. Police arrived but made no arrests, and hours later, Westminster authorised immediate steps to protect the UK's last virgin steel furnaces. At the dawn of the 21st century, China was a moderately sized steel player, contributing perhaps a quarter of global production. Then came the country's explosive infrastructure boom. Factories, high-rises, airports, and mega projects like the Three Gorges Dam. As domestic demand soared, Chinese firms ramped up production. By the time this boom began to plateau around 2010, their steel capacity kept growing, leading to enormous export surpluses. Western markets soon found themselves undercut by what many saw as dumping China's ultra-cheap steel, partly due to subsidies and cheap coal. When anti-dumping measures rose in the EU, UK, or the US, Chinese steel giants circumvented tariffs by establishing new mills in countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, or Malaysia, or by routing steel through partners in those regions. Meanwhile, Beijing launched the Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious series of overseas infrastructure projects that guaranteed a steady global demand for steel, almost always supplied by Chinese companies. Some Chinese producers, like Tsingshan, built massive complexes abroad to secure local resources such as nickel in Indonesia or to serve emerging markets in Africa. Even supposedly private Chinese firms follow a distinctive model. Each hosts a Communist Party committee, gains access to low-interest credit from government-backed banks, and acts in alignment with Beijing's broader strategy. While the Chinese government insists these companies act on market principles, Western critics argue that China uses state-supported pricing, covert manipulation, and expansions that crowd out rival producers, leaving entire countries reliant on Chinese steel. This, in turn, positions Beijing to apply subtle or not so subtle geopolitical pressure if relations deteriorate. When China's Jinyi took over British Steel a few years ago, it touted a revival plan. Yet more recently, the company began cutting essential orders of materials and apparently rejected the UK government's support packages. Workers on site felt something ominous was afoot, perhaps a deliberate sabotage or strategic strangling that would lead to shutting down Scunthorpe's furnaces. The meltdown came when Chinese executives arrived at the facility, only to be physically blocked by workers from entering key areas. Police were called in, and while no arrests occurred, the incident served as a dramatic expression of distrust. Within hours, Parliament introduced legislative measures that effectively let the government wrest control of British Steel from Jinyi. This arrangement is often described as nationalisation, though some officials prefer terms like golden share or emergency state stake. The rationale was straightforward. Letting these blast furnaces close would leave Britain without a domestic source for virgin steel, necessary for advanced manufacturing, military hardware, and large-scale infrastructure. In an age of heightened tension with both Russia and China, this seemed dangerously naive. Predictably, Beijing objected to the politicisation of Chinese investment. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said that one firm's actions do not represent all Chinese businesses, urging the UK to protect the legal rights of foreign companies. Yet many British MPs, including ex-party leaders, appear unconvinced. There's a palpable fear in London that China's real motive might be to gradually dismantle strategic Western industries from the inside, leaving the UK forcibly reliant on Chinese steel supply. While officials in Beijing brand these accusations as unfounded, they also see the West ramping up scrutiny against all Chinese involvement in critical infrastructure. The war launched by Putin has not only shaken global supply lines, but also re-emphasized the importance of self-sufficiency in strategic commodities like steel. If, for instance, the UK or other Western powers found themselves in an even broader conflict, reliance on foreign steel could hamper tank building, ship repairs, or large-scale industrial mobilization. The parallel is obvious. In some corners, people fear that losing British steel could create a vulnerability similar to Europe's reliance on Russian gas, but with an even deeper security dimension. Soldiers, Marines, and Air Forces all rely on steel-based systems. As the war continues, Western countries have poured arms and financial aid into Ukraine, pushing up demand for certain metals and leading to higher commodity prices. Meanwhile, Russia's partial or full blockade of resources has disturbed energy markets. In Britain, energy costs for heavy industries have soared. Critics say the green mania or net zero crusade has sidelined pragmatic policies driving up electricity rates and making British plants uncompetitive against coal-dependent Chinese or Southeast Asian production. This dynamic forms the background for how quickly or slowly the UK can salvage and modernise its steelworks. At present, China alone accounts for over half the world's steel output. Numerous Chinese producers overshadow the older Western steel giants, from Baowu, the largest state-owned steelmaker, to private behemoths like Tsingshan. Their presence extends worldwide, from building or buying mills in Africa and Asia to forging relationships with local governments under Belt and Road deals. For example, Tsingshan's facility in Indonesia has turned that country into a stainless steel powerhouse, while Hebei Iron and Steel invests in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Each time they expand, they fill local markets with cheaper steel than local producers can match. When domestic demand softened in China, these firms unleashed their surpluses globally, often priced below cost, as alleged by Western critics. The EU and the US responded with tariffs and anti-dumping measures, but Chinese companies deftly circumvent such policies. A persistent complaint is that Beijing is using market-distorting subsidies, cheap financing, and sometimes forced labour to produce steel at a fraction of the Western cost. Repeated accusations of dumping underscore how complicated it is for Western industries to remain viable. For years, experts have debated whether China's approach is purely commercial or partially guided by a strategic blueprint to undermine overseas steelmakers. British politicians recently alluded to a sabotage theory. that certain Chinese groups might aim to quietly incapacitate strategic foreign plants. However, direct evidence remains elusive. Even so, the ongoing case of Scunthorpe has rekindled suspicions that Beijing's ultimate objective might be to force British manufacturing to rely on imports from China, including for critical items. One core issue repeatedly flagged is that British steelmaking, like much of Europe's, faces steep electricity and carbon-related costs. To meet net zero targets, successive governments introduced environmental measures that weigh heavily on industries. Meanwhile, Chinese producers keep tapping cheap coal and receiving state support. Some UK lawmakers say, we can't keep punishing our own factories while letting China run laps around us. Others argue that climate goals remain essential, and the real problem is a lack of robust government strategy to help steel adapt to greener processes such as hydrogen-based production or carbon capture. For the moment, the UK has staved off an immediate closure at Scunthorpe. Raw material deliveries from overseas have resumed or are en route, ensuring the furnaces keep burning. The industry is relieved, but also aware that a lasting solution is needed. Business leaders talk about needing stable energy rates, capital investment, and advanced technology to produce higher value green steel. This reflects a recognition that Britain's steel must meet future environmental standards or risk losing out even in its own market, let alone globally. Many politicians across different parties now champion the idea of a golden share for strategic industries, giving the government the right to veto closures or major asset sales. This would safeguard national security if a foreign investor tries to shut down or relocate a facility. Some Tories want more sweeping powers, including mandatory government stakes in critical companies. Opponents say that might deter future investment, but the scandal at Scunthorpe has emboldened the protectionist side. Washington, under Presidents Trump and Biden, has embraced a certain degree of protectionism. The 25% tariffs on steel imports remain a prime example. Meanwhile, the European Union, though more cautious, has employed safeguard measures and anti-dumping duties. Yet none of these can fully address the overcapacity that China continues to export around the globe, whether directly or indirectly through third countries. Some economists call it a steel tsunami, which has battered local producers from Cleveland to Krakow. All this inevitably merges with the strategic dimension. If Beijing can shape or restrict steel flows globally, it could hold an industrial trump card in times of conflict or diplomatic standoff. Observers worry that such leverage might prove significant in hypothetical crises over Taiwan or in other tension points. Beijing publicly denies such an intention, but Western officials remain unconvinced. The events at Scunthorpe, though local in scale, highlight how a powerful foreign investor's decisions can spark chaos. The day workers in Scunthorpe barred Chinese executives from crucial areas of the plant was more than a local labour dispute. It symbolised a broader Western awakening. Strategic industries, once left to market forces, may demand state intervention to avoid geopolitical sabotage, whether literal or metaphorical. In a world where wars like Russia's invasion of Ukraine amplify the necessity for secure supply lines, Britain's last blast furnaces embody a stand for industrial self-reliance. Though the government's emergency measures have stabilised the immediate crisis, critics note that a deeper steel strategy is long overdue. Without addressing high energy costs, modernisation of facilities and consistent policies, the same panic could recur. Yet the UK's actions, coupled with mounting hostility toward Chinese ownership of critical infrastructure, signal a shift in how nations view foreign investment in sectors integral to defence and basic national needs. Looking beyond the UK, Beijing's overseas acquisitions and the Belt and Road projects continue to reshape steel's entire global ecosystem. If Western countries respond with stronger protections, we may see more nationalisation moves or coordinated alliances. Alternatively, if the West remains politically divided, China's steel supremacy could become even more entrenched. That would leave each country that neglected its own steel production vulnerable to political or supply chain pressures in times of crisis. In the end, the Scunthorpe saga reveals much about our era, the friction between green policy goals and industrial survival, the clash between free market ideals and the strategic imperatives of national security, and the uneasy realization that a single foreign corporation backed by a powerful state can exert massive influence over a community, a workforce, and indeed a country's ability to stand on its own. It's a microcosm of the 21st century power struggle where economics, geopolitics, and technology converge. Ultimately, whether Britain and other Western nations forge a more coherent plan to protect critical industries like steel remains to be seen. Yet at least for now, with Scunthorpe's furnaces still burning, the UK has declared that it won't idly watch its vital industrial heritage slip away into foreign control.